The flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror usually mean a minor inconvenience. But for Sergeant First Class Darius Reed, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would test every ounce of his military discipline. He had survived hostile war zones and grueling deployments, but nothing could have prepared him for the blatant disrespect and targeted humiliation from two rogue cops on a lonely North Carolina highway. They thought he was just another easy target. They mocked his uniform, his skin, and his service. What those officers didn't know was that Darius wasn't alone, and a heavily armed convoy of military police was already speeding down the asphalt to deliver a brutal, unforgettable dose of instant karma. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Highway 87, a long, heat-warped stretch of asphalt winding its way toward Fayetteville, North Carolina. The humidity hung in the air like a wet wool blanket, clinging to the pine trees that lined the desolate road. Inside his meticulously maintained Honda Accord, Sergeant First Class Darius Reed enjoyed the blasts of cold air from his AC vents. He was still in his operational camouflage pattern uniform, his OCPs. The name tape over his right breast pocket read Reed in stark black lettering, mirroring the U.S. Army tape on his left. Darius was a man of quiet dignity. His face bore the subtle, hardened lines of combat deployments and countless sleepless nights. He was a combat engineer, a man who cleared paths through minefields and built infrastructure in the most dangerous corners of the globe. Today, his mission was simple: drive back to his off-base apartment, strip out of his sweaty uniform, and rest. He had just wrapped up a grueling training exercise at Fort Liberty, his muscles aching with that deep, familiar fatigue that only soldiers truly understand. The radio played low, a classic soul station murmuring in the background, offering a stark contrast to the explosive drills he had orchestrated. He was driving exactly the speed limit as an active-duty serviceman and a black man driving in a rural southern county. Darius never gave anyone a reason to look at him twice. He kept his tags updated, his blinkers functional, and his foot light on the pedal. But as he crested a small hill near the county line, the unmistakable blare of a police cruiser caught his eye from a hidden dirt turnoff. Inside the cruiser sat Officer Shane Whitaker and Officer Leonard Shaw of the local county sheriff's department. Whitaker was a young rookie with a high and tight haircut, a chip on his shoulder, and a reputation for escalating minor infractions into major confrontations. He was the kind of cop who viewed the public not as citizens to protect, but as enemy combatants in a war only he was fighting. Shaw, his training officer, was older, counting down the days to his pension, deeply complacent, and too tired to rein in his aggressive partner. Worse, Shaw harbored old, quiet prejudices that he allowed to manifest through the actions of the young, hot-headed Whitaker. As Darius's Honda passed their hiding spot, Whitaker squinted through the windshield. "Look at this guy," Whitaker muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Tinted windows, riding a little low in the back. Probably hauling something he shouldn't be." "The windows look legal to me, Shane," Shaw said, stifling a yawn and sipping from a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. "Just let him go. We're close to shift change." "Nah," Whitaker said, turning the cruiser into drive and kicking up a cloud of red Carolina clay as he pulled onto the highway. He crossed the solid white line. "I saw it. Failure to maintain lane. I'm going to run his plates. Let's see what we've got." Darius watched in his rearview mirror as the cruiser closed the distance with terrifying speed, sitting practically on his bumper. He maintained his speed, his heart rate remaining steady. He hadn't swerved. He knew he hadn't. He kept his hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock on the steering wheel, his mind automatically shifting into the protocol his father had taught him decades ago, a protocol reinforced by the realities of the world. Suddenly, the cruiser's light bar erupted into a blinding frenzy of red and blue accompanied by a sharp, authoritative chirp of the siren. Darius sighed softly, a heavy, tired exhalation. He activated his right turn signal, slowly decelerating, and pulled his car onto the wide gravel shoulder of the highway, ensuring he left plenty of room for the officers to walk safely. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, rolled down all 4 of his windows, and placed both hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not reach for his registration. He sat perfectly still, waiting. In the cruiser, Whitaker ran the plates. Clean, no warrants. Registered to a Darius Reed. "Told you, Leonard," Shaw grumbled. "Just write a warning and let's get out of this heat." "Let me do the talking, Leonard," Whitaker said, adjusting his duty belt, making sure his hand rested casually but prominently near the grip of his sidearm. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the oppressive heat, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Shaw followed slowly, walking around to the passenger side of Darius's vehicle, standing near the rear quarter panel with his thumbs hooked into his belt. Whitaker approached the driver's side window. He didn't bend down to meet Darius eye to eye. Instead, he stood tall, forcing Darius to look up at him. An old intimidation tactic. "Do you know why I pulled you over today, boy?" Whitaker asked, his voice dripping with an unearned authority and a subtle venomous drawl. Darius's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the word boy. It was a deliberate choice of words, a loaded term that carried centuries of historical weight and disrespect. But Darius was a professional. He pushed his anger down, locking it behind a wall of military discipline. "No, officer, I do not," Darius replied clearly, his voice deep and calm. "I was maintaining the speed limit." "You were swerving back there, crossing the solid white," Whitaker lied smoothly. He leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the interior of the car, finally landing on Darius's uniform. A smirk tugged at the corner of Whitaker's mouth. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. My wallet is in my right back pocket, officer. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment," Darius stated evenly. "I am going to reach for them now." "Move slow," Whitaker commanded, his hand tightening over his holster. Darius reached back, retrieved his wallet, and extracted his driver's license alongside his green military identification card. He handed both to Whitaker, too. Whitaker looked at the driver's license, then squinted at the military ID. He flipped it over, rubbed his thumb across the plastic, and then let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Sergeant First Class, huh?" Whitaker sneered, looking Darius up and down. "You expect me to believe that? You look a little young and a little too unpolished to be a senior non-commissioned officer." Darius stared straight ahead. "I assure you, officer, the ID is valid. I am stationed at Fort Liberty and just heading home from a field exercise." Whitaker tossed the military ID back through the window. It hit Darius's chest and fell onto his lap. "I didn't ask for a life story. Hand me the registration." Darius slowly leaned over, popped the glove box, and handed over the paperwork. Shaw, watching from the passenger side, shifted uncomfortably. Even to his jaded eyes, Whitaker was pushing the envelope, but the unwritten code of the badge kept Shaw silent. He wasn't about to undermine his partner in front of a civilian, regardless of the civilian's uniform. "Hang tight, Sergeant," Whitaker said, putting air quotes around the rank. He turned on his heel and marched back to the cruiser. Darius closed his eyes for a brief second. The sheer indignity of it was exhausting. He had men under his command who trusted him with their lives. He had defused roadside bombs in hostile provinces while taking small arms fire. Yet here, on a dusty road in his own country, he was being treated like a common criminal by a man who looked like he'd barely graduated high school. Minutes ticked by. The heat inside the Honda became stifling without the air conditioning, but Darius didn't dare turn the key to turn the fans back on. He knew how easily a sudden movement could be misinterpreted or willfully misconstrued by an officer looking for an excuse. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of his uniform. Back in the cruiser, Whitaker was agitated. He had run Darius's license through the local, state, and federal databases. Nothing. Not a parking ticket. Not a late registration. Darius Reed was a ghost of good behavior. "He's clean, Shane. Crystal clean," Shaw said, tapping the dashboard monitor. "Write the warning for failure to maintain lane, and let's go. I'm starving." "I don't like his attitude," Whitaker snapped, staring daggers at the back of Darius's head. "He's sitting there in that uniform thinking he's better than us, thinking he's untouchable. You see a lot of guys buying surplus gear, trying to get discounts at the hardware store, trying to play hero. I bet that ID is a fake. Shane, you're reaching. Fort Liberty is right down the road. Half the town is military. It's not stolen. He's just a soldier going home." "I'm going to make sure," Whitaker said, his ego overriding any sense of logic or procedure. He grabbed his radio and stepped out of the cruiser again, his posture stiff, projecting aggression. Darius saw Whitaker approaching in the side mirror. The officer's stride was purposeful, predatory. Shaw followed this time, stepping slightly closer to the vehicle, his hand resting on his taser. "Step out of the vehicle," Whitaker ordered loudly as he reached the window. Darius didn't move immediately. "Officer, for what reason? I've provided my documentation." "I said step out of the damn car," Whitaker barked, his voice cracking slightly with full authority. "This is a lawful order. You were refusing to comply." "I am complying," Darius said, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "I am stepping out of the vehicle." Darius slowly opened the door. He swung his boots out onto the gravel and stood up to his full height. At over 6 feet, he possessed commanding physical presence, broad-shouldered and muscular from years of rigorous physical training. He towered over Whitaker. Whitaker immediately took a half-step back, his hand dropping to his service weapon. "Turn around. Face the car. Hands behind your back." "Am I under arrest?" Darius asked, turning slowly and placing his hands behind his back, interlacing his fingers as he had been trained. "You're being detained," Whitaker said, stepping in close. He grabbed Darius's wrists roughly, yanking them upward, a deliberate move designed to cause pain in the shoulders. Darius grunted, but didn't resist. He felt the cold, hard steel of handcuffs click and tighten aggressively around his wrists, biting into his skin. "Shane, is this really necessary?" Shaw murmured from a few feet away, glancing nervously up and down the empty highway. "Officer safety, Leonard," Whitaker replied, his voice dripping with condescension. He pushed Darius forward, slamming the soldier's chest and face into the hot metal roof of the Honda. The heat of the metal burned through Darius's uniform, but the physical pain was secondary to the searing humiliation. Cars were beginning to pass by. A minivan slowed down. The faces of young children pressed against the glass, watching a U.S. Army sergeant being treated like a violent felon on the side of the road. Whitaker began a rough, invasive pat-down, kicking Darius's legs wider apart. "You military boys think you own this town," Whitaker sneered close to Darius's ear. "You walk around in these pajamas playing war, acting like you demand respect. Well, out here on this highway, my badge outranks your little patches." Darius pressed his cheek against the hot roof, taking slow, measured breaths. "Maintain military bearing," he repeated in his head. "Do not give them a reason. Survive the encounter." "My military ID is federally issued," Darius said, his voice muffled against the car. "If you believe it's fake, you are obligated to contact the military police at Fort Liberty to verify my identity. You do not have the jurisdiction to arbitrarily detain active duty personnel without probable cause." "Oh, listen to the barracks lawyer," Whitaker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He pulled Darius back from the car by the chain of the handcuffs, spinning him around. I don't need to call anybody, boy. I am the law out here, and right now I'm investigating you for fraudulent identification and resisting a lawful detention. He wasn't resisting, Shane, Shaw interjected, finally stepping forward. Let's just cool it down. We've patted him down. No weapons. Let's take the cuffs off. Back off, Leonard, Whitaker snapped, his face flushed red with adrenaline and power. He looked back at Darius. Go sit on the curb. Now. Whitaker shoved Darius toward the grassy, trash-littered ditch on the side of the highway. With his hands secure behind his back, Darius stumbled awkwardly, struggling to maintain his balance. He managed to drop to his knees and then sit on the dusty ground, the dry grass scratching at his neck. He sat there, a decorated combat veteran, shackled in the dirt while a rookie cop on a power trip stood over him grinning. Whitaker strutted back and forth, seemingly basking in his absolute control over a man who in any other circumstance he wouldn't dare cross. We're going to search the car, Whitaker announced loudly to Shaw, ensuring Darius could hear. With an attitude like his, he's definitely hiding contraband. You do not have my consent to search my vehicle, Darius stated clearly from the ditch. There is no probable cause. I smell marijuana, Whitaker lied effortlessly, looking directly at Shaw, daring the older cop to contradict him. That gives me probable cause. Come on, Leonard, let's tear this thing apart. As Whitaker turned his back to begin rummaging through the meticulously clean interior of the Honda, throwing Darius's gear and paperwork onto the floorboards, a quiet electronic voice spoke from the vehicle. It was faint at first, but Darius heard it, and he knew exactly what it meant. What officers Whitaker and Shaw did not know, and could not possibly have anticipated, was the specific technological setup inside Darius's car. Earlier, before the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, Darius had received a phone call routed through his Honda's Bluetooth system. The caller was Captain Victor Lang, the Provost Marshal of Fort Liberty, essentially the chief of police for the entire military installation. Captain Lang and Darius had served together in Afghanistan. They were close friends and professional colleagues. Lang had called to discuss the logistics of an upcoming security detail for a visiting general. When Darius saw the police lights, he hadn't ended the call. He had simply tapped the mute button on his steering wheel. The line had remained open. A silent digital witness to the entire harrowing ordeal. For some time, Captain Lang had been sitting at his desk in the military police headquarters on base, a headset pressed to his ear. Initially, he thought Darius had just been pulled over for a routine check and was keeping the line open as a precaution. But as the audio fed directly into his ears, the aggressive commands, the racial undertones of the word boy, the sound of Darius being slammed against the car, the blatant lie about smelling marijuana, and the dismissal of Darius's federally issued ID, Lang's blood boiled. He recognized the sound of an illegal detention. He recognized the sound of rogue officers abusing their authority. Most importantly, he recognized that one of his most decorated NCOs was in immediate, unpredictable danger at the hands of local law enforcement. From his desk, Captain Lang hadn't just listened. He had acted. "Dispatch, this is PM Lang," he had barked into a secondary radio while listening to Whitaker rough up Darius. "I have an active duty soldier, Sergeant First Class Darius Reed, currently undergoing an unlawful detention and possible assault under color of authority by county deputies on Highway 87 near the southern gate. I have an open audio line. The officers are escalating." "Copy, Captain," the military dispatch had replied immediately. "What are your orders?" "Scramble the QRF," Lang ordered, his voice cold and deadly serious, referring to the quick reaction force of military police always on standby. I want 3 MP cruisers out there now. I want lights and sirens. I'm leaving my office and taking point. Nobody, and I mean nobody, touches my soldiers. Back on the dusty shoulder of Highway 87, Darius sat in the dirt, the metal cuffs cutting off the circulation to his hands. He watched impassively as Whitaker practically climbed into the back seat of his Honda, tossing a gym bag onto the gravel, unzipping it, and dumping out Darius's running shoes, gym clothes, and shaving kit. Shaw stood by the cruiser, nervously adjusting his sunglasses. He looked at his watch. Shift change had already passed. He wanted to be anywhere but here. "Nothing in the back, Shane?" Shaw called out, his voice tight. "Let's wrap this up. Seriously." "Shut up, Leonard." Whitaker's muffled voice came from inside the car. He popped the trunk from the inside. He walked around to the back, pulling out Darius's heavy military duffel bag. "Look at all this crap. Bet there's some stolen government property in here." "That is my issued field gear," Darius said calmly from the ditch. "I'm warning you, officer. You're crossing a severe legal line." "I thought I told you to keep your mouth shut," Whitaker yelled, taking a step toward Darius, his hand balling into a fist. Before Whitaker could take another step, a sound cut through the heavy, humid air. It was faint at first, like the distant whine of a mosquito, but it was growing louder rapidly, a high-pitched dual-tone wail that echoed off the pine trees. It wasn't the standard siren of the local county sheriff or the highway patrol. It was a deeper, more aggressive wail, the distinct sound of federal law enforcement vehicles pushing their engines to the absolute limit. Whitaker stopped, his hand hovering over the duffel bag. He looked down the highway toward the direction of the military base. "You hear that, Leonard?" Whitaker asked, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant features. Shaw turned around, shielding his eyes from the sun. The wail was growing deafening. "Sounds like a lot of units. Did you call for backup?" Whitaker asked, sudden panic edging into his voice. "No," Shaw said, his stomach dropping. "I thought you did." "I didn't call anyone," Whitaker stammered, abandoning the duffel bag and walking quickly back toward the cruiser. Darius shifted his weight in the dirt, a slow, grim satisfaction settling over his features. The cavalry wasn't just coming. They were already here. Over the crest of the hill, practically flying over the asphalt, came a massive, black, heavily armored SUV, its grille flashing with blinding red and blue strobe lights. Right behind it, running in a staggered tactical formation, were 3 pristine white military police Dodge Chargers, their light bars painting the trees in frantic colors. They weren't slowing down to observe. They were arriving with a terrifying, aggressive purpose. Whitaker and Shaw froze in their tracks. The roar of the approaching engines was earth-shaking. The black SUV slammed on its brakes, skidding slightly on the gravel shoulder, violently throwing up a massive cloud of dust that engulfed the sheriff's cruiser. The 3 MP Chargers boxed them in perfectly, one pulling directly in front of the cruiser, one blocking the rear, and the third angling itself sharply toward the center of the road, stopping all civilian traffic in both directions. The doors of the MP vehicles flew open simultaneously before the cars had even fully stopped rocking on their suspensions. Out poured several heavily armed military police officers clad in full tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and carrying patrol rifles at the low ready. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision that local cops could never hope to match. Leading the charge from the black SUV was Captain Victor Lang. He didn't look like a man who was there to negotiate. His face was a mask of furious, absolute authority. Military police, federal jurisdiction. Step away from the soldier. Keep your hands away from your weapons. And step back from the vehicle immediately, Lang roared, his voice carrying over the dying wail of the sirens. Officer Whitaker, his face completely drained of color, his previous arrogance evaporating like water on a hot stove, slowly raised his hands. Beside him, Shaw looked like he was about to pass out. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped, shattered, and burned to the ground. The hunters had just become the prey. The silence that descended upon Highway 87 was heavier than the sweltering North Carolina humidity. The only sounds were the heavy idling hum of the military police vehicles and the frantic, shallow breathing of Officer Shane Whitaker. The swirling red and blue lights painted the surrounding pine trees in chaotic strobes, casting long, intimidating shadows of the tactical team that had just enveloped the scene. Captain Victor Lang stepped forward, the gravel crunching under his heavy combat boots. He was a veteran of intense combat zones, a man who had stared down insurgents and warlords. The terrified rookie cop trembling before him didn't even register on his threat scale, but the anger radiating from the captain was palpable, a cold and focused fury. You don't have jurisdiction here," Whitaker stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the venomous drawl he had used on Darius just minutes prior. He took a shaky step backward, his hand still raised defensively. "This is county property. This is my traffic stop." "Jurisdiction?" Captain Lang repeated, his voice dangerously low, slicing through the tension like a razor blade. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. "You illegally detained a United States soldier without probable cause. You physically assaulted him under color of authority, and you ignored his federally issued identification. You crossed out of county jurisdiction the second you decided to play God with one of my men." Lang didn't take his eyes off Whitaker, but he raised 2 fingers in a sharp tactical gesture. "Private First Class Jamal Wright." From the rear MP Charger, a young, intensely focused military policeman broke formation. "Yes, sir. Get those cuffs off Sergeant First Class Reed. Immediately," Lang ordered. "Wait, you can't do that," Whitaker protested, a desperate squeak escaping his throat. He instinctively moved his hand toward his belt, a reflexive, incredibly stupid decision. Before Whitaker's fingers could even brush the leather of his holster, several MP rifles snapped out from the low-ready position. The distinct metallic clack of safeties being switched off echoed across the highway. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them, officer," Lang warned, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. "If you so much as twitch toward that duty weapon, my men will consider it a lethal threat. Do we have an understanding?" Shaw, who had been completely paralyzed by shock, suddenly snapped to life. He aggressively grabbed Whitaker by the shoulder and shoved him back. "Are you out of your mind, Shane? Put your hands on your head. Do it. Now." Shaw practically screamed at his partner before raising his own hands high into the air. "Captain, we are compliant. No weapons are being drawn." Private First Class Jamal Wright didn't hesitate. He bypassed the 2 terrified local cops and drove directly to the ditch where Darius was sitting. Wright dropped to one knee, retrieving a universal handcuff key from his tactical vest. "Are you injured, Sergeant?" Wright asked respectfully, his tone a stark contrast to the disrespect Darius had just endured. "Just my pride, Wright," Darius replied quietly, offering a small, appreciative nod. "And my shoulders." He clamped them on tight. "We've got you, Sergeant. Sit tight," Wright said. He slipped the key into the mechanism, turning it with a practiced flick of the wrist. The ratchets disengaged, and the heavy metal cuffs fell away into the dirt. Darius brought his arms forward, wincing slightly as the blood rushed back into his numb hands. He rubbed his wrists where deep red indentations had already formed into bruised rings. He stood up slowly, dusting the dry Carolina dirt off his OCP trousers. He didn't look at Whitaker or Shaw. He stood at the position of parade rest, his military bearing completely restored, projecting a silent, immovable dignity. Back on the asphalt, Whitaker was hyperventilating. "You can't just release my suspect. He was swerving. He refused a lawful order. I have it all on my dash cam." Captain Lang let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He reached into one of the many pouches on his tactical vest and pulled out his smartphone, tapping the screen to bring up an active call log. "I certainly hope your dash cam was rolling, Officer Whitaker," Lang said, stepping directly into Whitaker's personal space, forcing the taller cop to look down into the unyielding eyes of the provost marshal. "Because your dash cam is going to line up perfectly with the digital audio recording I currently have saved on Fort Liberty's secure server." Whitaker blinked, confusion momentarily overriding his terror. "Audio? Audio recording? You see," Lang continued, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "When you pulled Sergeant Reed over, he was on a Bluetooth phone call with me. He muted his end to comply with your stop, but he didn't hang up. So for the duration of this encounter, I've been sitting at my desk listening to every single word you said." All the blood drained from Whitaker's face. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. "I heard you call a decorated non-commissioned officer, boy," Lang listed, stepping closer, forcing Whitaker to back up against the side of his own cruiser. "I heard you lie about him crossing the solid white line. I heard you fabricate the smell of marijuana to execute an illegal search of his vehicle. I heard you slam his face into the roof of his car after he offered zero resistance. You didn't just break department policy, officer. You committed multiple federal civil rights violations." Shaw closed his eyes, a groan of absolute despair escaping his lips. He had known Whitaker was out of control, but hearing it laid out like this, knowing the federal government had a pristine audio recording of the entire encounter, made him realize his own pension, and possibly his freedom, were now ashes in the wind. "Captain, please," Shaw pleaded, his voice trembling. "I told him to back down. I tried to de-escalate." Lang turned his icy gaze to Shaw. "You stood by and watched your partner unlawfully detain and assault a citizen you were sworn to protect. Your badge is just as tarnished as his. Now both of you are going to stand exactly where you are. If you move, my MPs will restrain you. I have just gotten off the phone with the FBI field office, and your sheriff is currently en route." The trap had closed. The predators were caught in a cage of their own making. Some time passed. For Whitaker, it felt like an eternity. He stood pinned against his cruiser, sweating profusely, while several heavily armed MPs stood in a semicircle around him, their expressions completely unreadable behind their dark, tactical sunglasses. Darius, meanwhile, was treated like visiting royalty. Private Wright and another MP carefully picked up all of Darius's scattered gear from the dust, shaking off the dirt, and neatly repacked his duffel bag and gym bag, placing them gently back into the trunk of the Honda. The wail of a new siren pierced the air, this one deeper, accompanied by the low rumble of a heavy-duty engine. A massive white Ford F-250 with a county sheriff's star emblazoned on the side came tearing down the highway, flanked by two more county cruisers. The truck slammed to a halt, and Sheriff Harlan Pierce stepped out. Pierce was a bear of a man with a thick silver mustache and a reputation for being an old-school, no-nonsense lawman. He had served in the Marines in his youth and maintained a strict, rigid discipline within his department. Or so he thought. Pierce took one look at the scene. His deputies boxed in by federal military police, a black soldier standing by with bruised wrists, and a furious army captain waiting for him. And his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "Captain Lang," Sheriff Pierce called out, his boots striking the pavement with heavy, angry thuds as he approached. He extended a hand. "Sheriff Pierce, what in God's name is happening on my highway?" Lang shook the sheriff's hand firmly. "Sheriff, your deputies decided to go rogue. They executed an illegal traffic stop, unlawfully detained Sergeant First Class Reed, assaulted him, and attempted to illegally search his vehicle based on fabricated probable cause." "That's a lie," Whitaker shrieked, his panic making him completely lose his mind. Sheriff, he's lying. The soldier was belligerent. He was resisting. They're covering for him because he's military. Pierce turned to Whitaker, his eyes blazing. Shut your mouth, Shane, before I wire it shut myself. You will speak when spoken to. Pierce turned back to Lang. Captain, those are heavy accusations. I need proof. I was hoping you'd say that, Lang replied. He signaled to one of his men who jogged over and handed Lang a ruggedized field tablet. Lang synced with his phone, turned the volume up to maximum, and pressed play. The clear high-definition audio from Darius's Bluetooth microphone filled the highway. Sheriff Pierce stood in stony silence as he listened. He heard the swagger in Whitaker's voice. He heard the undeniable racial dog whistle of the word boy. He heard Darius's calm, perfectly respectful compliance. He heard the violent thud of Darius being slammed against the car. And he heard Whitaker openly admit to faking the smell of marijuana to bypass the Fourth Amendment. With every passing second of the recording, Whitaker seemed to shrink physically. He looked at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Shaw just stared blankly ahead, a single bead of sweat rolling down his nose, knowing it was over. The recording ended. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Sheriff Pierce slowly took off his Stetson hat, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. When he looked back up at Whitaker, there was no anger left in his eyes. There was only pure, unadulterated disgust. "Shane," Pierce said, his voice terrifying in its quiet. "Take off your gun belt." Whitaker's head snapped up. Tears were welling in his eyes. "Sheriff, please, I made a mistake. I got overzealous. I thought he was—" "Take it off," Pierce barked, a sudden explosive command that made even the MPs flinch. "Right now, and hand me your badge." Trembling violently, Whitaker unbuckled his duty belt. The heavy leather, weighed down by his sidearm, taser, and cuffs, fell to the asphalt with a dull thud. His hand shook so badly he could barely unpin the silver star from his chest. He held it out to the sheriff, sobbing quietly. Pierce snatched the badge from his hand. "You are stripped of your police powers effective immediately. You are a disgrace to this uniform, to this county, and to the oath you swore." Pierce turned to Shaw. "And you, Leonard, you stood there and let this punk play cowboy with a man's constitutional rights. You're suspended without pay, pending an internal affairs investigation. Hand over your belt and badge." Shaw didn't argue. He nodded slowly, unbuckled his belt, and handed over his badge. "Yes, Sheriff. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me," Pierce sneered. He turned around, walking past the humiliated ex-officers, and approached Darius. Sheriff Pierce stopped a few feet from Darius. He squared his shoulders, stood at attention, and delivered a crisp, formal salute. Darius, slightly surprised, returned the salute flawlessly. "Sergeant Reed," Pierce said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. "On behalf of the county, and on behalf of every decent law enforcement officer who wears a badge, I offer you my most sincere and profound apologies. What happened to you today was an abomination. It was cowardly, it was racist, and it was illegal. I promise you, I will personally see to it that the district attorney presses civil rights charges against Shane Whitaker to the absolute fullest extent of the law." "Thank you, Sheriff," Darius replied, his voice calm, projecting the quiet strength of a man who had won without throwing a single punch. "I appreciate your swift action." Captain Lang walked up to stand beside Darius. "We'll be following up with the FBI, Sheriff. The military takes the harassment of its personnel very seriously." "I expect nothing less, Captain. I'll hand over the dashcam footage to the feds myself," Pierce assured him. He gestured to the 2 remaining county cruisers. "My deputies will transport these 2 civilians back to the station. Sergeant Reed, you are free to go. And thank you for your service." "Let's get you home, Darius," Lang said, patting his friend on the shoulder. "Yes, sir," Darius said. He walked toward his Honda. As Darius opened his car door, he paused and looked back. Shane Whitaker, stripped of his gun, his badge, and his unearned authority, was being roughly shoved into the back of a county cruiser by another deputy. The arrogant, untouchable cop was now just a terrified civilian crying in the back of a police car, his career and future destroyed in a matter of moments of pure, unfiltered karma. Darius slid into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine purred to life, and the AC finally kicked back in, washing over him with a wave of cool relief. As he pulled back onto Highway 87, flanked by an escort of 3 military police chargers, he looked in his rearview mirror one last time. The flashing lights were still there, but this time they weren't a threat. They were a shield. The transition from an untouchable predator to a caged suspect is a jarring, violent psychological drop. For former officer Shane Whitaker, that drop occurred the moment the heavy steel door of the Cumberland County Sheriff's holding cell slammed shut, the echo ringing in his ears like a funeral bell. He sat on a cold, stainless steel bench, shivering in his undershirt. His badge, his gun, his authority, everything that had inflated his hollow ego, was gone, sitting in an evidence locker down the hall. The knuckle fallout was instantaneous, but the true nightmare for Whitaker was just beginning to cross county lines. Because Darius Reed was an active duty soldier on federal orders, the jurisdiction didn't remain solely with the local sheriff. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been notified the second Captain Lang ended his call on the highway. The case landed on the desk of the district attorney, Marcus Thorne. D.A. Thorne, known for his relentless prosecution of corruption and his deep ties to the Fort Liberty military community, took one listen to the unredacted audio recording and immediately coordinated with the Department of Justice. Thorne wasn't just going to hit Whitaker with a simple assault charge. He was going for the throat. Soon after the highway incident, Whitaker was transferred to an interrogation room that smelled intensely of bleach and stale coffee. He sat across from his union-appointed attorney, a weary-looking man who kept rubbing his temples. Across the table sat D.A. Marcus Thorne and 2 stern-faced FBI special agents. "Mr. Whitaker," D.A. Thorne began, his voice calm but layered with unmistakable severity. "We are not here to negotiate a minor slap on the wrist. I have reviewed the dashcam footage, and the FBI has forensically authenticated the audio recording provided by the Provost Marshal at Fort Liberty. You are looking at a multi-count federal indictment for violating 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, alongside state charges of false imprisonment, assault, and filing a false police report." Whitaker swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It was a mistake. I thought I smelled contraband. I was just doing my job." "Your job," one of the FBI agents interrupted, slamming a thick manila folder onto the table, "does not involve manufacturing probable cause to terrorize a decorated combat veteran. And unfortunately for you, Shane, this wasn't an isolated mistake." The twist that Whitaker hadn't anticipated was the cowardice of his former partner. The moment Leonard Shaw had been suspended and faced losing his pension, a pension he had spent decades securing, he immediately rolled over. Shaw had cut a plea deal with D.A. Thorne that morning. In exchange for immunity from federal prosecution and a recommendation for a lighter state sentence, Shaw handed the investigators everything they needed to completely bury Whitaker. "Mr. Shaw was remarkably cooperative," D.A. Thorne continued, opening the folder to reveal printed transcripts of text messages. "He detailed a systemic pattern of behavior. He provided us with access to your private squad car communications and a group chat you maintained with other junior deputies, a chat where you routinely bragged about targeting minority motorists, inventing traffic violations, and conducting illegal searches. Whitaker felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach plunging into an icy abyss. The group chat. He had deleted it, but he had forgotten that digital footprints never truly vanish, especially when the FBI comes knocking. "We also executed a search warrant on your locker and your residence," the FBI agent added, his eyes locked onto Whitaker's terrified face. "We found an assortment of undocumented cash, a few pieces of jewelry, and a collection of military challenge coins that did not belong to you. Trophies, Mr. Whitaker, stolen from the motorists you illegally shook down when you thought their cameras weren't rolling." Whitaker looked at his lawyer, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Do something. They can't do this." His lawyer slowly closed his notepad. He looked at Whitaker, not with sympathy, but with profound professional disgust. "Shane, given the evidence presented, the audio, the dash cam, the testimony of your partner, and the recovered stolen property, my official legal advice is that you prepare yourself for a very long stay in a federal penitentiary. There is no defense here. You are completely exposed." The walls of the interrogation room seemed to shrink, closing in on Whitaker. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He wasn't the law anymore. He was just a criminal who had finally picked the wrong target. He put his face in his hands and began to weep, the pathetic, gasping sobs echoing off the cinder-block walls. Meanwhile, Sergeant First Class Darius Reed was back at Fort Liberty, standing in front of his commanding officer. He was not reprimanded. He was commended. The military community rallied around him. The audio of the stop had been kept strictly confidential by the military and the DA's office to protect the integrity of the trial, but word had spread through the ranks. Darius became a quiet legend on base, the soldier who maintained perfect military bearing and let an arrogant cop hang himself with his own rope. Later, the imposing granite facade of the federal courthouse loomed over the city. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Shane Whitaker sat at the defense table. The physical transformation was staggering. Gone was the swaggering, broad-shouldered bully who had patrolled Highway 87. He had lost weight, his skin was pale, and he was dressed in a drab, ill-fitting prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist, the very same type of metal cuffs he had so gleefully clamped onto Darius's wrists now bound his own. The gallery was packed. Half the room was filled with military personnel in crisp dress uniforms there to support Darius. The other half was filled with local civil rights activists and disgusted citizens who had followed the high-profile case. Judge Patricia Langford, a formidable jurist known for her zero-tolerance policy regarding police corruption, presided over the sentencing hearing. Whitaker had pled guilty, realizing that going to trial against the mountain of evidence, including Shaw's damning testimony, would have resulted in a maximum sentence. He was throwing himself at the mercy of the court. When it was time for the victim impact statement, Darius Reed stood up from the front row. He was dressed in his Army service uniform, the dark blue fabric immaculate, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons denoting his tours of duty, his valor, and his unwavering service to his country. As he walked past the defense table, he didn't even look at Whitaker. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," Darius began, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent courtroom. "On the day I was pulled over, I was not treated like a citizen nor a soldier. I was treated like an animal. Mr. Whitaker used his badge not as a shield to protect the public, but as a weapon to enforce his own bigotry and insecurities." Darius paused, his posture perfectly straight, projecting the same unyielding strength he had shown on the highway. "I have spent my adult life defending the Constitution of the United States," Darius continued. "I have lost brothers in arms fighting for the freedoms the document guarantees. To come home and have those very freedoms stripped away on a dusty road by a man sworn to uphold them is a betrayal I cannot easily articulate. Mr. Whitaker thought he had the power to break my dignity. He failed, but he shattered the trust between law enforcement and the community. I ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of that betrayal. Thank you, Your Honor. Darius stepped down and returned to his seat, surrounded by the supportive nods of his fellow soldiers. Whitaker's attorney made a desperate, hollow plea for leniency, citing Whitaker's youth and inexperience. But when Judge Langford leaned into her microphone, her expression was etched with cold, judicial fury. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge began, her voice echoing loudly, "I have sat on this bench for many years. I have seen every manner of criminal behavior, but crimes committed by those who wear a badge are uniquely insidious. You took an oath. You were given the power of the state, the authority to deprive citizens of their liberty, and you used it to terrorize a decorated servant of this nation because of the color of his skin and the uniform on his back." Whitaker kept his head bowed, his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden table in front of him. "The audio recording of your conduct was one of the most disgraceful things I have ever heard in a court of law," Judge Langford stated flatly. "You mocked his service. You physically assaulted an entirely compliant man. You fabricated evidence to justify an illegal search, and, as the subsequent investigation proved, this was not an isolated incident. You were running a personal racist fiefdom out of your cruiser." The judge picked up her gavel. "Shane Whitaker, for the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law and the subsequent federal charges of civil rights violations, I sentence you to 108 months in a federal penitentiary to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from ever holding any position in law enforcement, security, or public office." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Over 9 years in federal prison. It was a devastating, career-ending, life-altering sentence, a hard, undeniable dose of absolute karma. As the bailiff stepped forward to escort Whitaker away, he finally looked up. He turned his head and locked eyes with Darius one last time. Whitaker's eyes were hollow, filled with regret, and the terrifying realization of the decade of confinement ahead of him. Darius simply held his gaze. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just watched the broken man be led away in chains, his own military bearing flawless. Leonard Shaw fared slightly better, but his life was irrevocably changed. Thanks to his plea deal, he avoided federal prison time, receiving probation. However, D.A. Marcus Thorne and Sheriff Harlan Pierce ensured he was permanently stripped of his law enforcement certification. He lost his coveted pension, forced to take a job as a night shift security guard at a local strip mall. His reputation was utterly destroyed in the town he had lived in his entire life. Later, the harsh summer sun once again beat down on Highway 87. Darius Reed, now promoted to Master Sergeant, drove his meticulously clean Honda Accord down the exact same stretch of asphalt. The radio played a smooth soul track. He was heading home after another grueling training cycle. He drove exactly the speed limit. As he passed the dirt turnoff where his nightmare had begun, he noticed a local county sheriff's cruiser parked in the shade. The deputy inside didn't rev his engine. He didn't pull out aggressively. As Darius drove past, the deputy simply raised a hand, offering a polite, respectful wave to the soldier passing by. Darius gave a small nod in return, keeping his hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. He drove on toward home, the road ahead clear, the ghosts of the past finally left behind in the dust. Justice had not only been served, it had reshaped the very road he drove on. If you felt the incredible satisfaction of instant karma in this story, make sure to hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone abusing their power, only to get exactly what they deserve. We want to hear your stories. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to spread this amazing tale of justice. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories of revenge, karma, and real-life justice. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.